When I started in benefits, we never spoke to the CFO or the CEO, and frankly, the directors of benefits rarely did either. Now, given how much healthcare costs, decisions are made at the CFO and the CEO level, and it's become a really important skill set for benefit directors to be able to navigate the C-suite.
Healthcare in America isn't just complex, it's chaos, with the information and power stacked against employers and patients. On Margin of Care, we set out to rebalance that scale. I could not be more thrilled to introduce Eric Grossman, a veteran benefits expert whose illustrious career included a 34-year stint at Mercer. We're talking about what Eric does best: concrete, practical approaches to vetting new healthcare solutions, implementing those solutions, and measuring their success or their failure. It's a treat for me to have him on and to gather a little more wisdom from an old friend. So Eric, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back together again.
You know, you've spent almost 4 decades in the benefits space at Mercer. What changed in the benefits landscape in your decades at Mercer?
It would be a much shorter answer to say what didn't change. So when I look back, when I started working in healthcare, benefits tended to be one size fits all. We hope you like it because this is what you're getting. Certainly the proliferation of data and tools to mine that data is a fundamental change that is really revamping the entire landscape. Benefits are not one size fits all anymore. There's a tremendous amount of employee choice in the system. What that means is the member has to assume more responsibility, and the member really needs to engage to make the right choices. Clearly, members have a lot more responsibility because they have to pay a much higher portion, not just in terms of their premium share, but in terms of cost sharing at point of care. As we all know, that has really exploded over the past 20 or 30 years. When I started in benefits, we never spoke to the CFO or the CEO, and frankly, the directors of benefits rarely did either. Now, given how much healthcare costs, decisions are made at the CFO and the CEO level, and it's become a really important skill set for CHROs and HR and benefit directors to be able to navigate the C-suite.
I think it really does also result, like over the last several years too, is like the employer was not necessarily responsible for being the one, like they're the ones that essentially had to offer the benefits, but they weren't the ones that were managing it. They weren't the ones that had to serve as sort of like the source of truth for employees on how to get care. Like the role of the employer has really shifted a lot in terms of helping to educate employees and their families on how to access care and how to actually shop for care too.
I think the sea change was with the explosive growth of high deductible health plans. When you're covered by a plan that has a $200 or $250 deductible, and has co-pays for almost every service, there's really no incentive for the employee to shop. So you find a doc that you like, and then you do what the doc says. And you don't think about it too much further.
Or by the way, shop for a hospital based on, the hospital that's nearest to you or that has the best marketing at the airport or billboard, or it might be.
Right.
Too. Yeah.
Right. But when you're faced with, a $1,500 or higher deductible, all of a sudden the vast majority of people are thinking, oh man, I really need to treat healthcare like I treat other purchasing decisions. Maybe $1,500 isn't like buying a car, but it's like buying a lot of other things. It's like buying a laptop. It's like buying a TV. You don't just throw a dart at the board and say, this is what I'm buying. So the high deductible health plans have created significant incentives for employees to shop for benefits. And initially, employers didn't really do much about that. But especially over the last 5 years, employers providing tools and resources to support employees in shopping. Gartner has been a pioneer in that in terms of shopping for quality. But it goes beyond shopping for quality. If you are faced with a chronic condition and your employer offers a program to help you manage that, 10 years ago, I might have said, why bother? It's a hassle. Now, all of a sudden, I have a financial interest in bothering. And employers have really capitalized on that. And let's face it, without employer involvement, a lot of the proliferation that we see in fairly narrow solutions aimed at supporting the member and helping them make better decisions wouldn't exist. So employers deserve a lot of credit for changing the market.
How would you advise employers right now to sort of manage through that and make the right decisions that are ultimately ones that could be sustainable over time from a trend perspective?
Most employers have reached the end of material cost shifting. There's just so much you could push on to the member, and most organizations are there. You're probably dealing with a less than happy CFO and CEO because of healthcare costs. And for all the money you're spending, you're probably finding that employee satisfaction and understanding of the benefits is, let's just say, less than ideal.
Yeah.
So what to do is easy to articulate, but it can be hard to do. You need to be open to new approaches, even if you're initially uncomfortable with them. And I know from a lot of employer discussions, for example, in the area of provider quality rankings, a lot of HR people are initially very uncomfortable with steering care to a subset of their provider network. You need to be open to it. You should be open to offering different programs to different employees. If one size fits all doesn't work anymore from an employee choice perspective, it doesn't need to work from an employer perspective either in terms of what you offer. A lot of companies seed HSAs for employees who earn below $50,000 or $60,000, but not above that. That's a minor example, but be prepared to perhaps offer programs to lower wage workers that just wouldn't be appealing to high wage workers. If you have the size to do it, be willing to pilot, especially when a solution is really new. And the last thing I'll say is, as the primary party who pays for the benefits, the employer, obviously there's employee cost sharing, but most of the freight is still picked up by the employer. I think you need to recognize that you have the right to ask your employees to engage in the programs that you offer and to reinforce that with some teeth in the engagement.
We're starting to see this proliferation of things like reference-based pricing and ICRAs, et cetera, where like you're truly putting the onus on the employee. If they exceed whatever that stipend is that employer is putting towards the program, like it's on them. Do you think those things have legs, or is it really that you just have clients that are sort of like, this is sort of like their last option, and it's almost like their Hail Mary to kind of figure it out before they have to make some really, really difficult, like overall business decisions?
So when it comes to reference-based pricing specifically, if employers weren't concerned about the potential for very significant member balance bills and then potential legal action around them, it would be the pervasive way that benefits are offered in the market.
Yeah.
Because the typical reference-based pricing might set the reimbursement to the provider at 150 or 170% of Medicare. Trust me, you're paying a lot more than that in terms of your commercial rate. So there's enormous money on the table, but it is that concern that you don't want your employee to wind up with a $12,000 balance bill that they have no hope of paying. And then eventually they get brought into collection agencies and litigation. Now, I think there are ways to manage that, but a lot of employers haven't been able to get past that initial barrier. And that's prevented the growth in reference-based pricing. Fortunately, there are other opportunities.
There's a lot of big promises that are out there, sometimes a lot of big disappointments too. So like one of the topics that I wanted to cover on this discussion was like this concept of skepticism. Like employers have tried a lot of strategies over the years. I think the average large employer now has something like 16 different vendors within their benefit ecosystem right now. And rather than adding a bunch more, they're actually starting to get a little bit more thoughtful about measuring, evaluating, and actually taking things away right now. So there's a healthy level of skepticism out there. I think a lot of it is driven by the fact that these solutions aren't doing what they ultimately said they were going to do, or people aren't actually using the tools that these organizations are investing time and money in. Where's the line between healthy skepticism and then the kind of cynicism that can block real progress?
So some degree of skepticism is good, but to me, the line is when skepticism blocks action. There is no perfection. And if you're looking for solutions that have zero risk and certainty of results, you're going to be looking for a long time. Now, that means how you evaluate solutions in terms of driving through that skepticism really varies. And I'd put solutions into three categories. The first category are, brand new solutions out of the gate. And if you're going, you're going to be one of the first. And to consider that, I think overall in your organization, you need to have a culture of innovation. You should get input into the solution if you're one of the first, and you should get preferred pricing. And that may help you break through the skepticism. Then you have, relatively new, few years of operation. And I think what you need to look at to determine whether your skepticism is well-founded or whether you could break through it is whether there's a credible demonstration of early results. And by results, I don't just mean financial. Are we improving clinical metrics? Are we engaging the right people? Are we engaging them in the right numbers? At the end of the day, you probably want to see financial results, but there are a lot of leading indicators that need to happen to get there. Does that solution have meaningful market interest and uptake? Are they offering strong performance standards? After all, if they don't believe enough in their solution to stand behind it, why should you believe in it? And then the third category, I'll call them mature solutions. At this point, skepticism is either pervasive and it's threatening the viability of the solution, or we've gotten past it. And then it's really just a matter of, do they offer value to your organization? Is the return, the expected return, worth the investment? And, to your point, Kirk, in terms of, average of 16 different solutions, I agree. That proliferation is probably too much. I would advise organizations every year, or at worst every other year, review your solution set. When we've done that for clients, we have found a lot of overlap, and we have almost always identified opportunities to have some consolidation without deteriorating in any way the overall value that we're delivering to members and to the company.
Sitting on something and sort of letting it get stale over the period of just 3 or 4 years, like a lot's changing in the market. So it's always worth going back out and, number one, measuring what you have in place today. And is it actually doing what you expected it to, and adding value for you financially, adding value for your employees and for their families, and they're staying engaged and they're satisfied with it. But then certainly, what other things are out there that, you just didn't know about a couple of years ago because your other vendors weren't doing it, or there's new vendors that sort of popped up in the ecosystem that are doing it newer and better and using better technology or different and better engagement tactics too. So, one of the things that we often come across, and I think we're still a little bit of an early mover into the space that we are right now. We're not the first ones to talk about provider quality, but the way that we sort of do it and sort of manage it in a non-disruptive way, we're sort of one of the early ones there. It's easy for an organization, whether it's a consultant that's advising their employer client, or even as we're talking to employers, it's easy to come up with reasons why they shouldn't pull the trigger and do it this year. We're facing a 15% increase, but we can't make this change. And it might be because we don't have the resources to allocate it, whether that's time or staffing or financial, or we think that our employees aren't going to understand it, or we think it's going to cause a little bit too much friction. When you sort of think about these conversations, when you're bringing ideas to an employer, like, how have you addressed those concerns where you're bringing something that you truly think is valuable and viable, but inertia just sort of stands in the way from the employer's perspective?
I get it. Most companies are dealing with very scarce resources, I would encourage people to assess what they're going to do in a few key dimensions. Expected value to your members. You got to put, I know the money's important, but you need to put your members first, because that's who you're trying to keep healthy. That's who you're trying to keep employed. Who does it impact? And do we have a large enough population where it makes sense? And if maybe we don't have a large enough population, then is the cost impact on the smaller population really large? Certainly you want to look at the cost and the ROI. Not everything, by the way, needs to have an ROI. So that's why over the last few years, the concept of VOI, value of investment instead of return on investment, lets you look at maybe some softer measures of ROI. How difficult will it be for the members to engage in the solution? If it's hard, they're not going to do it. So why bother? And finally, look at implementation complexity. And do we, the employer, have to do the heavy lifting in the implementation? If the answer is we have to do a lot of heavy lifting, it's much less likely to occur. And, finally, I always like to look at what controls are in place around privacy and security of data. You do not want to be on the wrong end of that, obviously. But, if we could find a solution that has strong value to members, is easy for members to access and use, that has a good either ROI or VOI, and is not going to kill us to implement, we have something worth considering.
What is the appropriate level of effort of being aggressive that a consultant or an employer should have, as it is essentially tied to like dictating to the health plan or dictating to one of the other vendors that like you have to figure out a way to play nice in the sandbox with this new solution in order for things to work harmoniously, in order to have like the best coordinated and most seamless experience from the member perspective? Because a lot of times what I hear are blockers that pop up is like, I don't think this is going to work well with, such and such medical care that I have right now, because they're not going to be willing to play nice in the sandbox.
Yeah, it could be frustrating, because you are absolutely right. Those blockers are out there. Your health plan may say, we will not work with such and such. We will not send them data. We will not integrate from a deductible and out-of-pocket limit perspective, which is generally required. If you're a very large employer, 25, 30,000, 50,000 employees, you may need to push. You may need to nicely threaten. You may need to ask your consultant to not so nicely threaten. I always enjoyed playing good cop, bad cop. You can guess which one I was. But you make it clear that our future relationship depends on some degree of interoperability. Now, how much we go to the mat on that would depend on how strong the solution is that we want to offer. But with large employers, you will almost always be successful. With smaller employees, let's face it, you just don't have that kind of leverage. So what we would often do is aggregate employers, whether it's in a formal coalition or informal. We would have very senior level relationships with our carrier partners and work with them collaboratively. And by and large, took some time, by and large met with success. One of the nice things is that if you are with one of the major carriers, we all know who they are, and you find them too rigid, you could go to their TPA arm. They all have them, pretty much get the same network, get a lot of the same services, maybe even get lower fees, and find a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to build, attach. There is leverage that we have over the carriers to make these things happen. And it has gotten better.
Yeah, I think the competitive pressures have pushed them, but that barrier, that friction still does exist for sure. We come across it every once in a while. So even as what we think to be a non-disruptive solution, the carriers also sort of have their own thoughts on what it is and what it isn't. And oftentimes it's like, how do we demystify what they think in their mind the solution is and show them like, this is not a competitive threat to you. This is actually going to help you look better to the members, because at the end of the day, it's their throat to choke, but they could also be the hero at the end of the day too, if they are willing to, coordinate and innovate alongside of that employer.
Right.
You talked about the concept of piloting, and I realize that this is something that's typically reserved for like very large organizations. So, sort of with that disclaimer aside, the experience that you had with large employers that you were working with who did say, hey, like, we like this idea. We're not totally sure we want to launch this thing to tens of thousands of employees, but let's start with this particular location or this particular, employee category. Talk about examples of like where that's actually worked well. And like the client's like, this is going great for the pilot. I'm going to expand this and go broader, or maybe instances where it didn't work so well.
I've seen two types of pilots. One is what I'll call a pure pilot. We're offering a solution and it's going to be offered to our 3,000 employees in this warehouse facility in a certain location, one division within the company. I actually think it's a really good approach if you are not certain whether this solution makes sense. And I've seen it happen where pilots result in expansion to the entire population. And I've seen it work where pilots, fizzle out after a year or two because it didn't achieve the desired results. When you have a very mature solution or a mature solution that has demonstrated results, I typically wouldn't recommend a pilot. I view pilots as more for more innovative or early adopter solutions. Second type of pilot, not common, but I have seen it, is where an employer will put in two solutions. They're never identical, but they try to approach the same problem. And group A gets one solution, group B gets another solution. I've actually seen that happen with advocacy vendors. I've seen it happen with certain condition management vendors, but it's basically a bake-off. And
wow.
They look at a couple of vendors on a real basis rather than just hypothetical and see whether it works. Now, again, you need to be large to do that, but it certainly puts a lot of burden for performance on the vendors.
Sure. And I guess part of the issue with that, like oftentimes impact or significant impact's not going to be from day one. So the client has to be willing to do that for some extended period of time to actually see claims mature, et cetera, too. But that's a really fascinating idea. I hope a lot of people are listening to this and thinking about how they could do that. I think, Gartner as an organization will be very willing to participate in what you call the bake-off.
And maybe I shouldn't say this, but you guys do have what I view as a unique approach. I think you'd show pretty well in that bake-off.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that. So when you kind of think about the fact, you did what you did all day, every day for a long time. You focus on benefits. How do you think, if you were putting yourselves in the shoes of an employer right now, how could you work most effectively with your employees around making sure that they understand and are getting the most out of the program that's being offered, given the fact that they're just not that focused on this? It's just all reality on a day-to-day basis.
Right. And nor should they be focused on
right.
it. And that's what's led to the proliferation of advocacy solutions, both carrier directed and non-carrier directed. The whole purpose is to take what is really complex for the typical person and make it easier. When I look though at effectively engaging employees, recognizing that they're not going to read a 20-page booklet and they don't want to spend a ton of time on this. Depending on your culture, I think you have three approaches. You can require, you can encourage, or you could just put it out there and do nothing. Requiring can actually work. Initially, it'll make some people unhappy. Encouraging, I think, is much more common, but it could also work as long as you have the right personalization and incentives. Please do this is not going to work. If you choose the high deductible health plan and we'll seed your HSA with $500, or if you contribute to the 401k and we'll match you, or if you get care from a high quality provider, we'll waive your cost sharing, could be enormously effective. So the decision still rests with the employee, but you are encouraging that decision. Now, in my view, it's incumbent upon you to still make it as easy as possible for the employee to engage. And finally, if you take the approach of, putting solutions out there and just doing nothing to encourage employees, I think you'll find that doing nothing usually leads to nothing. So I would say don't waste your time.
One final question. So what is the one thing that you would hope the next generation of benefits leaders, whether it's employers or benefits advisors, what's the one thing that you would hope that they hold on to as this cost curve continues to not bend like we need it to?
So I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but if I am, oh well, this is what I truly believe. In your core business, if there's no innovation, whether it's in, product or service design, how you deliver your products and services, sales, marketing, you're going into a death spiral. Every solution that employers have started offering in the last few years, Gartner and many others, started as a very disruptive solution.
Yep. Disruptive idea.
And always from the point of view that disruption is not only good, but it's necessary to drive change. Yeah. And we could all agree that we need change in how healthcare is delivered.
Well, that's a pretty powerful place to end. So Eric, thanks again so much for the thoughtful discussion, the impact you've had on the field and my career. I just really appreciate you being here today with us.
Thanks, Kirk. I'm really happy to do it, and I appreciate it.
If you're liking the conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been enjoying Margin of Care, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you've got feedback or questions or something you'd like us to cover on the show, send us a note anytime at marginofcare@getgarner.com. We'd love to hear from you.